Okay, let's welcome on our special guest for this part of the podcast, Tolkien fan Marie-Louise Miesel. Welcome, Marie.
Hi, Marie.
Hi. I'm very honored to be here.
Marie, we've known you for a number of years, and you have a background. You're actually a second-generation Tolkien fan. Give us an idea of how Tolkien entered your life.
Well, actually, my first exposure was in the cradle. My parents actually got the illegal Ace editions of the books and were reading them to me. They came out in 1965, just after I was born. So they would read bits of it, poetry and stuff, because apparently it put me to sleep when I was in the cradle. And then I read The Hobbit. I enjoyed it when I was in grade school, but I didn't really get into Fellowship. My sister read the covers off the books that my parents had. But when I heard about the movies coming out, and I've always been a big fantasy literature fan, I started reading the books, and I was older. I was probably in my 30s when I finally read them. And oh my gosh, it was like, where has this been all my life? It's just the richness and the depth was just blew me away. And so I pretty much gobbled up everything I could get my hands on, and gone to some events and joined the Tolkien Society and became part of the chapter here in Nashville. And it's just amazing. It's hard to put into words how important he is personally and just in the world of literature.
Well, that's unique in the fact that your parents supported science fiction and fantasy from a young age with you. We're the exact opposite. It's not that our parents didn't support it. They didn't understand it. Whereas you started going to conventions at a young age as well. Isn't that correct?
Yes. I went to my first science fiction convention when I was 7 years old. We made them a family affair. There was a couple of Midwestern conventions that we always went to. There was the MidwestCon in Cincinnati. We went to ShambanaCon in Champaign, Illinois. We went to RiverCon in Louisville. My parents didn't take us to Worldcon because they didn't want to have to keep track of us in a bigger convention. But yeah, we went to conventions, and there were other people my parents' age who had kids that were similar in age. So we just kind of ran around in a pack and did stuff. And it was just kind of normal. And my parents had read science fiction and fantasy literature almost all our lives. So it was just kind of part of our household. And they were very good about, they took us to the library, and they really just exposed us to things and didn't tell us, well, you need to like this because. They just sort of let us find our own taste in things, which I think is super important.
So where did you grow up, and what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in Indianapolis. I'm the oldest of three kids. We all went to Catholic school. I was very awkward as a child. I mean, I got glasses when I was in second grade.
Oh, you must have looked adorable, though. I have to say, kids with glasses look adorable. So I bet you're a cutie pie as a kid.
Well, at the time in the late 70s, it was not cool. So it was hard. And we didn't really fit into the suburban milieu that we were in. I mean, my parents loved art, they loved literature and history. And so, they were not concerned about material, looking the part. Like, we didn't buy fancy cars, we didn't belong to the country club. So I was really socially awkward. But when we went to conventions, I really felt more comfortable, and I found people that were like me. And so it was really a nice escape. And again, like I said before, my parents were really good about exposing us to different things. We went to the art museum regularly. We went to the library regularly. We listened to classical music. And we grew up with art in our homes. They would talk about history at the dinner table, just whatever they were reading. And I think that sort of broad-based cultural exposure really encouraged us to explore our own interests.
That was great.
That's why we get along so well. We're birds of a feather.
I used to really resent it because, when you're a teenager, you want to be like everybody else. And now I just have such a deep appreciation for the opportunities and the education I received in my home, outside of what school was providing.
Yeah, and we appreciate that too, is because you're I mean, you're deep into Tolkien fandom. You read the works now. You're actually tell us about. We're part of Loma Lindy, the local Tolkien SMEAL. So you welcomed us with open arms when we joined. You are a spearhead of Tolkien fandom in the Nashville area. Tell us a little bit about Tolkien fandom SMEALs, what that exactly is and how that developed, and your part in it.
Okay, so the SMEALs are individual chapters of the Tolkien Society, which is based in England, and they're not dues related or anything like that. They're just an opportunity for local Tolkien fans to get together and talk about Tolkien, do activities together. Some chapters are more organized than others. Some even produce their own newsletters. I actually joined when Dr. Amy Sturgis was still here. She was the one who actually founded the Schmeal. And then I sort of took over when she moved away. And I just try to invite people to come and join us for different activities and try to do book discussions. I've started doing a little craft night because a lot of people do like sewing and costume creation, and just a chance for people to exchange ideas and be with people, like be with their tribe, as the phrase goes. And that was part of the reason I joined too, is I just wanted to be around other people who love Tolkien as much as I did.
That's great to find your people.
Oh, yeah. And this is a great way to do it without feeling pressured. Like sometimes when you go to a convention or a conference, like you've got all these people who seem to know more than you do. And a small chapter situation is great for kind of getting your feet wet and feeling more comfortable. Because there's a lot of people who have like social anxiety or, you know, are like, oh, will they like me or whatever. So, and I like making ours more laid back so that people who are strictly movie fans or not necessarily into the books as heavily as say I am, everybody can feel welcome and participate.
So let's talk about the pronunciation of his name, Marie. So is it Tolkien, Tolkien, Tolkien?
It's Tolkien, I believe, is the correct pronunciation. But of course, that's always up for debate. I've heard Tolkien. I believe it's originally a German name. So it may have the last syllable may have gotten flattened out when they came to England.
I've heard Tolkien oftentimes as the absolute definite version, but most people call it Tolkien. Like, I think that's almost the Americanized version of it.
Yeah, because we shorten out that E sound a little bit.
And I'm not one to nitpick over every little thing. You know what I mean? When people say things like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, yeah, we know it's not a trilogy. It's one volume, then it's divided into 6 books. I don't freak out over all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, too, when you start nitpicking, if somebody is literally not knowledgeable, like they don't know, I mean, you really make them feel bad when that happens. And so you can gently correct them and say, well, he really meant it as one long book, or it's divided into 6 individual books put together. But if you look at the great mythologies like Arthur or Roland in France, or even the Eddas, they're collections of stories knitted together into one volume. So I think that was partially Tolkien's aim in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, we're going to speak about the man J.R.R. Tolkien in Humphrey Carpenter's authorized biography, because this is the one that I had growing up, and I only knew of this one because this is the one that was most readily available. And over the years, there are quite a few biographies. So let's talk about this book. What did you find? What were some of the highlights that you found about J.R.R. Tolkien that, especially early on, that helped him develop this magical world of Middle-earth?
Well, in reading it the first time and going back and looking at some things now, I realized how important his mother was to his early development, academically and intellectually, as well as the influence of their home at Sarehole Mill country house with the working grist mill and that kind of stuff. That was hugely made a deep impression on him. He was there from the age of 5 to 7, I believe. And his brother was younger, but that made a deep, deep impression on him. And I think he put that in the soup, so to speak, and used it later on in his life. And of course, his mother was extremely important to him. His father had died when he was just a baby. He didn't really remember him. But his mother basically raised him and his brother until he was 12 and his brother was 10. And just the affection and the love and the exposure to languages and things and the ability to go and play and do things that his mother afforded him, as well as her conversion to the Catholic Church. Catholicism was very important to her, and it became very important to J.R.R. as well.
Yes, so it touched on, even though he was born in what is now considered South Africa at a very young age, he moved to England, and that became from, 7 years old, I think, he started developing his own languages. Now, how crazy is that? That you're that young and you find such a fascination with language that you want to develop your own languages. And this became essentially the root of Middle Earth. Yeah.
I mean, there's a quote, I'm not sure if it's in the biography or elsewhere, that he basically wrote the stories, particularly the Silmarillion stories, to fit the Elvish languages that he was developing. He had a secret language with his cousins that he developed. And so he fiddled around with language for a long time. And I think for Tolkien, he's unusual in the sense that he was very, very attuned to how language sounds and how those sounds fit whatever like object or whatever that is describing. And so it's an aesthetic sense that not a lot of people have. And I think that was a huge driving motivation for him as far as the Elvish languages in particular. He wanted them to not only describe, but sound beautiful. He met his wife, Edith, when he was 16. He was an orphan living in a boarding house with his brother, and she was in the same boarding house. And he was at school, and he was supposed to be studying for a scholarship to get into Oxford. Well, he met and fell in love with Edith. Unfortunately, his guardian at the time, Father Francis, was very upset, not only because he hid this romance from him, but the fact that Edith was older. Edith was also Episcopalian or Anglican, as they're called in England. And it was distracting him from what he should have been doing. So Father Francis basically forbid Tolkien from contacting her until he was 21. So you have that thwarted romance that looms very large in the story of what became the story of Beren and Luthien. And he also went to Oxford and completed his degree before he went into the Lancaster Fusiliers and participated in World War I. He actually, in light of his love of languages, he became a signalman. So that was very appropriate for him. Sending messages by signal, flag, lantern, candle, whatever. But I think the exposure to not only the industrialization of the war at that time, but just the futility and the disgustingness of it. I mean, trench warfare was awful. It was muddy. It was gross. There were lice everywhere. It was just a really miserable existence. And the war basically was futile because it didn't accomplish anything except kill a bunch of people. And that sense of loss, because he lost two of his best friends in that conflict, just added to the sense of loss that he had with his mother and his favorite home. I mean, that's such a huge part of his life, is the sense of loss and that nothing is permanent. And, as Galadriel says in Lord of the Rings, we have fought the long defeat. And I think Tolkien felt like a great portion of his private life was a long defeat.
Yeah. We can see that there's influences within the works of especially how he had a distaste for machinery and loved comfortable countrysides.
Yes. And it was an idealized countryside, I will say that. But he disliked modern mechanics and he hated cars. He didn't like railroads per se, although he got the inspiration from the Welsh coal cars that came through Birmingham to start creating Sindarin. But he really liked the country slow country ways, slow country and the beautiful countryside with the trees and the grass and everything. So it definitely was a harsh change of environment for him to go from the safety of Oxford to the battlefields of France.
So let's talk about post-war Tolkien.
Okay. When he came back, he actually got lucky. He got trench fever, which is a disease you get from the lice. So he got invalided back to England. So he was not part of a lot of the major battles. And that's part of the reason he survived the war, is he basically got invalided back to England. He had graduated with a first in English language and literature, which set him up to be an academic. So he got his first position at the University of Leeds, teaching English language and literature. And he was definitely in love with philology. And philology was actually still part of the curriculum at that time for English language and literature. That's the language part. And so he had a young child by that point. He and Edith had married when he became 21, and then they set up their housekeeping, and he got his first job at Leeds and then was later called to be a professor at Oxford.
Now that's exciting, because what was he able to accomplish as a professor at Oxford?
Not a lot. His academic career, he did do some very good translations of Anchornwise, which is a book was an Anglo-Saxon book for anchorites who were religious, who basically cloistered themselves. But honestly, one of his biggest things, which is still being talked about today, was his lecture, The Monster and the Critics, which was his lecture on Beowulf, where he, instead of viewing Beowulf as a piece of history, viewing Beowulf as a work of art and literature. And that was very different from the interpretations that had been put forth before. Started working on the Silmarillion, what would become the Silmarillion tales, in 1918 and 1919. He actually was inspired by an Anglo-Saxon line about Arundel, the morning star over the Middle Earth, was the phrase. I can't say it in Anglo-Saxon, I'll just butcher it, but he was fascinated by this, and that's where the Silmarillion tales came from. And he had loved telling stories to his kids. He had 4 children, and he told stories. Rotterdam, which is in a book form of itself, which is a story about a dog, was a toy that one of his sons had lost. So he made up a story about all the adventures this dog had gone on. And The Hobbit in part was an oral tale that he was telling his children. And so when he was grading exam papers for extra money, he got the phrase, "In the ground, a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." And The Hobbit was actually a separate creation. It didn't really plug into the mythology until later, but he had been working on the tales that are in the Silmarillion for a long time, through the 20s and 30s. But when his publisher wanted a sequel to The Hobbit, that's with Lord of the Rings, that's when the greater mythology got pulled in. And there are lots of Silmarillion references in the Lord of the Rings. And then he had to retrofit The Hobbit so it fit better in with the rest of the legendarium.
So for the sake of the public, The Hobbit was the first published work. And so that was the introduction that the average person had to Tolkien's realm, even though he was working on a variety of other things. So, I mean, just let's think about the grandeur of this world and how crazy his mind was, that he was working on this for decades. But the public was only able to get it in pieces. And a good amount of it we didn't even get until after he died with regards to the Silmarillion.
Yes. Christopher undertook the task to edit the best versions, what he felt were the best versions of the Great Tales and the First Age and all that, into the Silmarillion. And then he undertook the task of releasing all the related writings, which are known collectively as the histories of Middle Earth. And you can also see, the beginning versions of the Lord of the Rings and how characters changed, and his attempt to put the whole legendarium, kind of tie things together in there. So he wrote a lot. I highly recommend reading Leaf by Niggle, because that is very autobiographical in some ways. He just wanted to niggle around with his Middle Earth stories. He didn't want to have to do all this other stuff, academic wise and that kind of stuff. And of course, obviously he couldn't do that. He was getting paid to teach. So, but Leaf by Niggle is very telling, because, Niggle is very concerned about one leaf on this tree, and he doesn't ever get to paint the whole tree. So I won't tell anymore, but that's kind of how he was. He kept trying to perfect things and try to fit things together. And obviously with stories and writing spanning decades, it's hard to do that.
And he didn't get his first published work of The Hobbit until later on in life. He wasn't an author per se. He was a professor that happened to write a popular book. And it took, roughly 12 years for the Lord of the Rings?
Yes.
And that's worth mentioning, is the camaraderie with others. They formed a group called the Inklings, which C.S. Lewis was a member of.
Yeah, it was very similar to the TCBS, which is the Tea Club and Barovian Society. He got very close to three boys at St. Edward's School, where he went for grade school, high school, basically. And they would talk and share their love of literature and all kinds of things together. And that was really part of his initial artistic expression, was being part of that group. And then when he found like-minded people in the Inklings to bounce ideas off and discuss things, it really encouraged his artistic expression.
So we know that he became known as a successful author later on in life. This biography notes how fame affected him. Didn't you find that curious, as an older man, all of a sudden he becomes an international superstar?
I think for him, he was, one of the last of the Victorian generation, and he didn't like the attention, and his legendarium had become very personal to him. It was like another child. And to feel like all these other people are invading what had been a private space, I think just was very off-putting to him. He didn't really understand it very well. I would not say he was very media savvy.
But he was very personal. In fact, it noted that he made an effort to write back answers when people would write him letters and ask him questions about details about his works. He would take the time to write back fan letters and detailed fan responses to the fan letters as well, because he cared so much about his work that he wanted the readers to understand it.
Yes. And his collected letters are also really good, but you have to be careful, because occasionally he will contradict himself, because his ideas about how things worked always changed. And so the subject of canon comes up a lot, and it's really hard to tease out, quote unquote, what should be canon. Typically the definition is whatever he wrote. Well, is the Silmarillion canon? He did write it, but it was organized and arranged by someone else who knew his mind very well. Christopher was closest to him, but it's not him. And so that is also an interesting debate. But his letters are amazing, and just some of the things he says, particularly about the end of Lord of the Rings, when Frodo is on Mount Doom and he can't destroy the ring, and how that works out is very powerful stuff. Why he wrote it the way he wrote it, basically.
Absolutely. So this is an awesome insight, reading or rereading the authorized biography by Humphrey Carpenter. And we enjoyed looking it over, because he's one of the authors that, in order to understand his works, you really have to understand him. And you see the contrast, the parallels. You see how his life was poured into his work. What other books have you read about Tolkien with regards to biographies that you would recommend to understand him better?
John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War is really, really insightful. What turned out to be a very formative period in his life in terms of his overall creation of Middle-earth. Also, if you're really nitpicky about details, Hammond and Scull have the chronology, which is literally a chronology of Tolkien's life almost down to the day, along with their reader's guide. It's now available in a second edition, and it is 3 volumes instead of 2. So there's a lot of detail in that because they were given permission to look at a lot of the Tolkien papers in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So Carpenter's biography is a great place to start, but there's a lot more.
And I like Carpenter's biography because it starts out with him going into Tolkien's home. And so it gives us an insight as to what he was as an older man, what his house was like, what his habits were like. So it wasn't just a retrospect of his life. It was from what he's heard, he actually met with him.
I like Tom Shippey's Author of the Century as well.
Yes, that's a very good one. And of course, that really explores the language aspect of Tolkien's life, which I think is awesome. I mean, a lot of people, he disliked allegory. No, what he did is he took everything in, mixed it all up, and then put it back out as literature. But you can see influences and traces, and it's not one-to-one comparisons. This is probably what, one of the big examples, of course, is the tanks in World War I eventually become like the Balrogs in one of the versions of The Fall of Gondolin. So his experiences in the trenches definitely colored his, the Dead Marshes, for example, are very similar to what No Man's Land would have looked like. So, it's there. It's not, like I said, not one-to-one comparisons or allegories per se, but it's more a sense, and you get that atmosphere of different aspects that had influenced his life, for sure.
So why do you think that Tolkien's work remains popular?
I think his work remains popular because people see themselves in the characters, and they see that, fighting for good and what was good and true is still worth fighting for. And the love and the friendship that's shown by the fellowship, the landscape, the enchantment, that you feel like you are visiting fairy in a way. Like his short story, Smith of Wootton Major, goes into fairy, and you that secondary world is so believable and so real that you are transported there, and you don't worry about, well, what are they doing for food? What are they doing for, sanitation? You're just there and you're experiencing it. And the characters just speak to us as humans in so many ways.
Yeah, we agree. Marie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so flattered.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.